Hi, friends. Today, we're talking about one of the biggest, if not the biggest, crusade since the Great Crusade. This was a humongo crusade that rallied the many forces of the Imperium, reintroduced the idea of organization back to humanity, and was headed by the instant money button that is Robude Gilliman. We're talking about the Indomitus Crusade. After the tragic fall of Acadia, the forces of the Imperium were sent reeling at the destruction brought on by Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. But they told Mr. War Master of Chaos, "Oh, so you like 13 so much, little guy? Well, fuck you, 13th Primarch, bitch!" And with the help of the Yanari, rest in peace, this wacky party resurrected Robude Gilliman from stasis and interred him in the armor of fate. And with one of the Emperor's sons back alive and kicking, the Imperium's darkest hour now had a wee little Primarch shaped light to ease the pain of losing the Imperium's second most important planet, the galaxy getting torn in half, and evil ass demons everywhere. And upon waking up, Gilliman would immediately get to ass kicking, utterly annihilating the Black Legion forces that tried to prevent his resurrection, and then he set off for Terra in order to reunite with his father and figure out just what the heck to do with the disgraceful state of the Imperium. And so, after a series of fights, most notably against his brother Magnus, Gilliman made it to Terra and spoke to the Emperor. Although it's not outright stated what exactly was said in this conversation, Gilliman left the throne room and declared himself the Lord Commander of the Imperium as well as Imperial Regent. As Lord Commander, Gilliman would defend against a huge second siege at Terra and then began work on weeding out the corrupt leaders of the Imperium and planning on how to recover from the losses in the 13th Black Crusade. He replaced corrupt High Lords with ones that more closely aligned with his vision for the Imperium, and he began to prepare for the Indomitus Crusade. Gilliman would put out a call for all Imperial forces across the galaxy to convene on Terra if they were able to. He even called for any chapter, regiment, or whatever other Imperial unit of soldiers there were to abandon war zones that they were likely to lose, since it would both avoid unnecessary casualties and they could reclaim it later with the larger and more organized Indomitus force. And like most things that Gilliman did at this time, it was pretty controversial for a Primarch to lead a great crusade of all the Imperial's forces. Last time this happened, like, I don't know, 10,000 years ago, a little heresy happened, and then some guy segmented all the forces of the Imperium to prevent such a thing from happening again. And that guy was named, Robude Gilliman. But regardless, Gilliman's the main character, and also the Emperor maybe told him to do so he could do whatever he wants. So he gathered a humongo force composed of guardsmen, space marines, sisters of battle, custodies, and basically any other Imperial capable of shooting and slash or. Oh, you know what? Actually, I guess and slash works. Gilliman would organize his huge force into 10 giant battle fleets, which were further split into battle groups, those being further divided into task forces, and then so on and so on. The primary purpose of this crusade was essentially to spread across the galaxy, reclaim Imperial worlds as fast as possible to re-establish dominance over Imperium Sanctus, so it was important that the crusade force was segmented in order for it to divide and conquer. Additionally, as the crusade went on, the fleet was meant to reinforce Imperial forces already fighting on worlds that they encountered, and after liberating a planet, they would requisition some supplies from the reclaimed planet in order to keep their momentum. However, the crusade also had the secondary purpose of delivering Gilliman's new Primaris Space Marines to the chapters who were unable to return to Terra. Their initial crusade force largely consisted of Primaris Grey Shields, also known as the Unnumbered Sons. These were Primaris Marines clad in grey, waiting to reunite with their parent chapters. Thus, a notable detachment would be the Torchbearer groups. These were specialized groups of Custodes, Sisters of Silence, and Mago Spyology who were accompanying the fleets so that they could introduce the new Primaris Marines and teach chapters how to make more going forth. And this force org not only tickled Gilliman's logistics autism, but it was also designed to allow the giant fleet to systematically move across the galaxy and reclaim worlds all around, rather than just having a big dum dum mob rambling about. Each fleet would be led by a fleet master who would coordinate their own mini crusades, sending each of their battle groups on their own campaigns. The battle groups were all totally self sufficient, and beyond major orders and an occasional strategic council, they would work completely autonomously from their fleet. This stratified force would allow the Indomitus Crusade to cover huge chunks of the galaxy and claim worlds at a quicker rate. However, the complexity and logistical machinations of such a large and intricate crusade could only truly be understood by Mr. Logisticin Gilliman. But even Gilliman has his limits. Plus, he doesn't just want to be a nerd staying inside doing homework all day. Gilliman likes to play. So, he established the Officio Logisticarum in order to handle the logistics of the Indomitus Crusade so that he could go play outside with his new toy from his dad. The Officio Logisticarum ensured the forces of the Indomitus Crusade were well stocked and sent to the right places, both of these infamously being a problem for the Imperium. In addition, as the crusade went on, the battle fleets would establish hub fortresses in order to keep the Officio well informed and to handle logistics on the furthest reaches of the crusade. But anyways, with that nerd stuff out of the way, we can finally talk about the fighting of the crusade. The Great Crusade would initially start out slow since Abaddon attempted to jail them in their deployment by assaulting warp nexuses. This slowed down the first stage of the crusade and forced the Imperials to take riskier warp routes. But after some initial roadblocks, the crusade would begin to pick up steam and they started reclaiming a lot of worlds. They also kind of went on a 40k greatest hits tour, visiting famous worlds like Armageddon, Rin's World, Necromunda, Fenris, Catachan, and honestly, probably any other one you could think of considering how wide-sweeping this crusade was. And about 5 years into the crusade, the initial goal of the crusade was largely complete since the crusade had reconquered enough worlds to re-establish relative stability in Imperium Sanctus, and they destroyed enough chaos forces to quell a bunch of warp storms. However, this is 40k after all, and the most iconic sentence of the setting is that there's only war. So, of course, more problems arose as the myriad threats of the galaxy started a bunch of wars. Around this time, the Chaos Forces were also becoming worryingly unified for a faction called Chaos, and they continued to sow chaos. Perhaps most notably, the Death Guard launched their plague wars in the realm of Ultramar. But for almost half a decade or so, the Crusade wore on, and many epic Warhammer 40Ks were had. Then, 12 years in, Gilliman would semi-abandon the Crusade to return to his home and assist in the escalating Plague Wars, which is a video for another time. But anyways, after kicking his stinky bro back into the warp, Gilliman would finally start to bring the Crusade into Imperium Nihilus. Gilliman's forces would continue to reclaim worlds and attempt to gain control of safe passageways through the Great Rift so that they could aid Imperium Nihilus. Taking a risky route to Nihilus, Gilliman would eventually arrive just in time to save the Blood Angels at the devastation of Baal. And after meeting Dante, Gilliman would be like, "Yeah, this dude's chill AF, man," and appoint him the Regent of Imperium Nihilus. Then, after delivering some supplies, primaris reinforcements, and doing some more battling, Gilliman would return to Sanctus. And at this point, I think the Indomitus Crusade is technically still going on, and the reason I say I think is because GW keeps retconning the Indomitus Crusade timeline and events within. Originally, the Crusade lasted like 100 years and was officially concluded when Gilliman fought in the Plague Wars. But then this was changed to the Crusade only lasting 12 years before Gilliman fought in the Plague Wars because a 100-year time skip is just stupid. And they just declared, you know what, man, I don't even know at this point. Let's just say time is broken. So technically, canonically, the Crusade was both 100 years long and 12 years long. And probably everything else years long because the Great Rift opening literally broke the galaxy's time flow. And to the people typing, actually, technically time already flows at different rates because of relativity and blah 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 blah. The rift broke time so hard that the differences in time are even more drastic than would be naturally possible. And also, technically, that means that nothing I said in this video can be factually incorrect because if so, the warp did it. But with that said, that's the gist of the Indomitus Crusade. Basically just a big old crusade to retake worlds lost with the opening of the Great Rift and a vessel to hold big old epic Primarch battles and other wars. And as you likely know, I'm not generally a fan of Primarchs in 40k, but Even a silly guy like me has to admit that Gilliman going around kicking ass and fighting his demon brothers does kinda go hard. But also, the Indomitus Crusade is essentially the jumping off point for basically all of the current conflicts in the present setting, which I suppose isn't saying too much considering it was essentially a galaxy wide crusade. But, anyways, let me know what you think of the Indomitus Crusade, and what do you think of the current era of 40k? To me, the fall of Cadia and subsequent resurrection of Gilliman definitely marked a huge shift in 40k and GW's approach to the setting, so I'd be interested to hear what you guys think of it. I swear the Primarch ore is real because when I was drawing Gilliman, whew, just looking at that guy, it really made me want to spend some money. Hi friends, today we're going to talk about a very stinky, smelly war that smells smelly. Perhaps the most iconic conflict of the Indomitus era and the conflict to kick off 8th edition and the Age of Primaris, we have the Plague Wars. Soon after the opening of the Great Rift, the smelly little bitch Nurgle, Lord of Decay and all things sick and icky, saw the huge crisis the Imperium was facing with the galaxy getting torn asunder and thought, it's free real estate. Specifically, the Plague Father wanted to annex the legendary realm of Ultramar. So he would start the Plague Wars. The Plague Wars would first begin not in Ultramar, but rather in a few systems north of Ultramar. Nurgle's forces would seed the planets in these systems with evil ass diseases which would easily spread and ravage the dense hive cities. And from the deaths of the Imperials, new Nurgle forces would be born. With the Imperials of the system enfeebled by Nurgle's plagues, his demonic legions were able to establish control over the systems with relative ease, and Nurgle's mini-empire would become known as the Scourge Stars, and would serve as Nurgle's spawn point for the upcoming invasion of Ultramar. And technically, at least according to the Codex, the Plague Wars were only the battles to claim the Scourge Stars, but everyone just considers the following battles to also be part of the Plague Wars, so we'll just stick with that. Plus, it's a lot cooler to say Plague Wars than X Battle and X World of Warzone Ultramar, so, you know. Anyways, though, with the Scourge Star secured, Nurgle would order his top 3 commanders to finally invade the realm of Ultramar. The first strike would be carried out by the demon Primarch Mortarion and his Death Guard legions. Morty had a cute little Nurgle-themed 7-step plan to take over his brother's empire and make his new daddy proud. Similar to the tactics used to win the Scourge Stars, the Nurgle forces heavily utilized virus bombs to infect and weaken the defenders of Ultramar. Hive cities and agri-worlds were targeted to starve the Imperials of manpower, as well as literally starve the manpower that remained. Then, after the virus bombings, Mortarion would lead huge invasions, utilizing the Death Guard's favorite attrition tactics in plotting assaults, most importantly of which would be on the planet of Espandor, with Mortarion's creeping Doom offensive, fighting a grand war of attrition with continent-long trench systems that would make a Krieger muddy his trench, if you know what I mean. In addition, Mortarion would also destroy a bunch of weakened worlds in an attempt to goad Gilliman into returning to his home and facing him in a glorious Primarch battle. But, along with Mortarion, Mr. Evil Bastard himself, Typhus the Traveler, as well as Nurgle's favorite former little guy Kugath, the Great Unclean One, would join the war and would lead their own Plague Fleet and Demonic Legions respectively. Typhus led his Plague Fleet to terrorize the outskirts of Ultramar, as well as disrupt Ultramar supply lines. Kugath, on the other hand, would manifest in the hospital world of Ajax to both destroy the researchers making cures to Nurgle's gifts and to convert it to a garden world to create new plagues. And thanks to the near infinite reinforcements from the Scourge Stars, a key strategy of the Nurgle forces was to attack as many worlds at once in order to capitalize on their superior numbers and attritional skills, in order to overwhelm the Ultramarines and Ultramar Auxilia. As the attacks escalated, Rabuda Gilliman would finally decide to break off from his Indomitus Crusade and return to defend his home. Upon returning, Gilliman's strategic genius would bring the Death Guard assaults to a halt as he brilliantly crafted counterattacks and defenses to the Death Guard plans. And upon learning of Gilliman's arrival, Mortarion would redirect his forces to the forge world of Connor. Connor is a major industrial center, a key defensive world on the path to Macragge, and it guarded one of the few stable warp routes in and out of the Macragge system. So, Mortarion sought to take over the world to both bleed the Imperial war machine and to strand the bulk of the Ultramarine forces in the Macragge system. And the invasion of Connor would be one of the most crucial and violent battles in the Plague Wars, as both sides waged wars in labyrinthine manufactorums and vast hive cities. The war would culminate with Mortarion literally launching the infected Death World Lobos across the system like an evil-ass super plague ball. But with great sacrifices, the Imperials managed to pull a badass Death Star 2 run to the core of Lobos and plant a cyclonic warhead in the core to destroy the Plague World before it could devastate Connor. But despite Gilliman leading the Imperial forces to many important victories, the superior numbers of the followers of Nurgle would continue to slowly overwhelm the Ultramarines. And to make matters even worse, Kugath was working on a plague that would be potent enough to kill Gilliman. But fortunately for the Blue Boyos, a bunch of Ultramarine successors would return to Ultramar and assist their Gene Father. And with the extra manpower, Gilliman was able to plan a brilliant counterattack. Gilliman's first major offensive was the Spear of Espandor, in which he sought to reclaim Espandor from Mortarion's creeping Doom offensive. Beyond reclaiming lost ground, controlling Espandor would also cut off major supply lines and Nurgle reinforcements from the Scourge Stars. And so, after securing the world, Gilliman was able to launch system-wide counterattacks since the Death Guard and Nurgle legions could no longer rely on their near-infinite reinforcements. These counterattacks were very effective and forced the Chaos forces to rush their plans as they launched a huge attack against Parmenio. On this world, Titans clashed, greater demons raised armies, and Marines wreaked havoc. Able to permakill the greater demon Septicus with the Emperor's sword. However, he would later fall into a trap where Mortarion, Typhus, and Kugath jumped him. The three champions in Nurgle nearly killed the Primarch, but he was saved by Imperial Saint Kalia, who maybe, most likely, almost definitely was possessed by the Emperor at that moment to aid Gilliman. Which also technically means that the greatest warriors of Nurgle got beat by a little girl. Typical Nurgle L. But with the defeat on Parmenio and the other Chaos Gods launching an invasion on the Scourge Stars, Nurgle beckoned his forces back to his realm. But Mortarion and Kugath decided to disobey their master in a bid to earn the eternal glory of slaying Gilliman and conquering Ultramar. So, the two bubonic bozos continued their alliance while number one Nurgle fan Typhus followed Daddy's orders and went back to defend the Scourge Stars. And despite the embarrassing loss on Parmenio, Kugath was able to get some of Gilliman's blood, which would be crucial in finally developing a disease able to fell the Primarch, the God Blight. And so, Mortarion and Kugath goaded Gilliman to clashing yet again on the world of Ajax. And although Gilliman knew it was likely a trap, he simply couldn't pass up on an opportunity to beat the shit out of his evil-ass brother. Oh, and also save his citizens, but probably mostly for the epic fight. So, he led Indomitus Fleet Primus to invade Ajax and put a stop to Mortarion once and for all. On world, Gilliman and Mortarion engaged in an epic duel as Kugath terrorized Gilliman's forces. And in the climatic battle, Ultra Mega Chad, Katie, and Colonel Odermeyer fucking tank shocked Kugath, impaling the greater demon with his Lehman Russ's battle cannon, and then jumped out to stab Kugath in the face, banishing Nurgle's favorite and the most badass sacrifice ever. Typical Guard W. Meanwhile, in the Primarch clash, Mortarion had gained the upper hand against Gilliman thanks to all the warp energies and demonic power surging through him, and he infected Gilliman with the God Blight. And, true to its name, it would be a blight to a god. But, foolish little demon, Gilliman is no god, no sirree. The God Blight would in fact become a blight on the Blight God. In death, Gilliman had a vision of his father, and the Emperor channeled his energies into his last son and briefly possessed the fallen Primarch. the Emperor restored Gilliman's body, forced Mortarion to flee into the warp, and inflicted a blow directly on Nurgle's garden, permanently wounding the Plague God and ending the Plague Wars. And so, with Nurgle's forces banished, Gilliman and the people of Ultramar would decontaminate their realm, and Gilliman would attend to other important matters. And most recently, Gilliman would task Captain Titus in reclaiming the 500 worlds of Ultramar, which include, but are not limited to, those lost to Nurgle in the Plague Wars. And on the chaos end of the poop stick, Kugath was made into a gross little ball sack waiting to respawn, and Mortarion was pulled into Nurgle's evil-ass mansion for some punishment. But Mortarion would later be released to fight in the War in the Rift against the forces of Tzeentch and Khorne, and he would redeem himself there. And that's just about it for the Plague Wars. Very cool stuff. I would really recommend reading the Dark Imperium trilogy if you thought the Plague Wars sounded cool. While the battles are, of course, very epic, I think the most compelling part is Gilliman and his little journey throughout. But be sure to comment what you think about the Plague Wars. And also, I'm actually curious to read about it, but if you were in the hobby when Gilliman and the Plague Wars were first introduced, please let me know what it was like back then. I'd love to see a first-hand account. Also, Gilliman proclaiming he's the last Primarch just goes so hard, man. I'll never stop lamenting at what could have been. Hi friends, today we're going to talk about exactly what the heck a Primaris is. And that's a simple answer. The Primaris Psykers are simply the most powerful and elite of the Imperial Guard's sanctioned Psyker ranks. We talked about Guard last week and now we have to do Marines. Okay then. And also, I'm gonna primarily focus on the lore of the Primaris, as the controversy behind them has been covered pretty well and is kinda old news at this point. So, let's get ready to plagiarize, throw your stupid old toys away, and talk about the super ultra even cooler Marines that you need to buy now! Primaris Space Marines are the newest versions of Space Marines created by Archmagos Belisarius Cawl. These guys are stronger than Firstborn Marines and were 10,000 years in the making. Sometime after the Horus Heresy had concluded, Rabute Gilliman gave Cawl some of his and his brother's very special seed, along with some other cool toys to make a new breed of Space Marines to better defend the Imperium. The most important of these cool toys was a little doodad called the Sanct Primus Portum. This was an artifact that contained the genetic material of all the Primarchs, including the Lost and the Heretical. This allowed Cawl to study the various Primarchs' gene flaws and potentially fix them. And the other artifacts given to Cawl helped him develop the new Marines. But I reckon they could have helped a little bit more, considering it took Cawl 10,000 years to finish his little project. Or, you could choose to believe my personal, extremely moronic but funny headcanon that Cawl is just a chronic procrastinator, much like myself, and his boss going into a mega coma probably didn't help this either. So, he could have finished the Primaris project in like a work week, but he slacked off for 10,000 years until the fall of Acadia and resurrection of Gilliman presented a sufficient oh shit moment for him to finish and submit the Primaris at 11:59 p.m. But back to actual canon. Cawl mostly finished his project a little after Abaddon split the galaxy in two at the fall of Acadia. When Gilliman returned and took command of the Imperium, he ordered Cawl to unveil his Primaris Space Marines in order to help the Imperium regain stability after the birth of the Great Rift. These first Primaris were known as the Awoken, since they were mostly recruited in the times of the Heresy and were actively worked on by Cawl since then. The initial wave was mobilized for Gilliman's Indomitus Crusade and proved a powerful and useful force in fortifying Imperium Sanctus and reclaiming Imperial worlds lost in Imperium Nihilus. Half of the original batch of the Awoken Primaris were used to make new chapters in the Ultima Founding, and the other half formed the Grey Shields. The Grey Shields were meant to reinforce existing chapters, but fought as one unit until they were able to reunite with their true chapter. Also, was this supposed to be a little joke reference to Unpainted Marines? Like, you technically do have an actual lore justification for fielding Grey Primaris as soon as possible along with your old Painted Marines. I don't know, I just thought that was funny. But regardless, once they reinforced their chapter, they would ditch their gray armor and adopt a proper chapter heraldry. The only mark they retain is a gray chevron over their chapter symbol. The reception to these new Marines varied from chapter to chapter. Many welcomed them as much needed reinforcements, while others felt skeptical, didn't trust the Mechanicus, or outright didn't accept Primaris as true brothers since they lacked culture and were weirdos. But Lucky for the primaris and unlucky for anyone who didn't like the primaris, the custodies usually escorted the new recruits and encouraged them to accept their new brothers. But despite what they felt about primaris, there is no doubt that they proved helpful in these trying times. These new Marines are bigger, stronger, and more resilient. In addition, they had fancy new gear whose machine spirits especially liked them since these Marines were made on Mars. However, these original Marines did have some weaknesses other than being social outcasts. First, they were made to only specialize in their unit type in order to give them a comparable expertise in these fields to firstborn veterans. This made the new Marines especially inflexible and less versatile than their famously jack-of-all-trades firstborn counterparts. For example, a Hellblaster would only know how to blast hell, while an aggressor only knows how to blast fist guns and look cool. They also lacked true experience. They had all the theoretical knowledge needed and sometimes even exceeded their firstborn counterparts in this field, but they had absolutely no practical experience. So, compared to the potential veterans of centuries and even newly recruited firstborn who likely face a ton of challenges just from their aspirant trials alone, the Primaris lacked valuable experience. In Pokemon terms, they had perfect IVs but no EVs. But despite any hiccups, the Primaris were a success and they proved valuable. They were a symbol of hope in one of the Imperium's darkest hours. But even so, these reinforcements, no matter how powerful, were not enough to vanquish the enemies of the Imperium and reverse the incredible decline of society. Thus, more Primaris would need to be made to continue humanity's fight for survival. Of the new Primaris, there would be two kinds, the Indoctrinated and the Ascended. The Indoctrinated were simply Primaris Marines made from aspirants, just like Marine chapters usually do. Call taught the chapters how to create new Primaris, and, well, they did that. Some chapters made all of their new aspirants Primaris, while others more skeptical chapters only made a fraction of the new aspirants Primaris. And the Indoctrinator was generally better than the Awoken since they had the best of both worlds, getting Primaris enhancements along with the valuable experience and training of traditional Firstborn. The final type of Primaris were known as the Ascended. These were Firstborn Marines who underwent the Rubicon Primaris to get Primaris enhancements. For a full-fledged Astartes across the Rubicon was a dangerous endeavor, and Call even warned against it as the operation was not yet fully perfected. It was said that there was only about a 40% survival rate initially. Unless, of course, you were a named character. If so, the survival rate skyrocketed to an astonishing 110%. Whoopee! Which also, honestly, is okay. I'm in the camp that thinks plot armor used well is a good thing. I don't think anyone really wants their favorite character to die to medical malpractice. Anyways, despite the risk, many Marines sought more power to better fight for the Imperium and underwent the risky operation. And it was a grueling process. In order to cross the Rubicon, a Marine is cut open literally from head to toe, opening them up for the procedure. Then, their ribs are cracked open to give surgeons access to all their organ systems, and then, their healing factor is suppressed literally to the point of death so that the extra Primaris organs can be implanted. The Magnificat is implanted in the brain, the Belisarian furnace is added, which stimulates rapid growth, which is incredibly painful to normal Marines since it causes their bones and muscles to rapidly break apart and reform themselves, and finally, the sinew coils are added by encasing their sinews in Durasteel, which is also incredibly painful. And after all these are implanted and the Marine is closed up, the surgeons resuscitate the Marine. Then, those strong enough are able to come back to life by activating their Belisarian furnace to reinvigorate themselves, and they are reborn Primaris. Those not strong enough have their organs harvested in order to be used for other aspirants. And since the Marine essentially needs to be killed and reborn, the Rubicon Primaris has become somewhat of a last resort operation to save gravely injured Marines, as was the case with guys like Titus and Ragnar. Also, after the Rubicon, many Marines' personalities changed. Since the Primaris Marines were built to be more cold and efficient warriors, those who underwent the Primaris operation ended up more cold, detached, and callous, among other things. For example, this can partially explain why Titus felt a bit different than he was in Space Marine 1, along with the centuries of torture, of course. And another example is that Primaris are generally less caring towards the normal humans of the Imperium. Yet another reason to dislike them. But anyways, after a while, the operation became sophisticated enough that it was rare for Marines to die to the Rubicon, and almost every Marine undergoes the operation now. Which, looping back, I suppose I should go over exactly what the primaris augments are. Firstly, there's a Magnificat. This organ stimulates growth and amplifies all the other Space Marine organs, especially the Osmodula and Biscopia. These are responsible for Marine's enhanced bones and muscles respectively. So, essentially, the organ increases a Marine's enhancements, especially their durability and strength. Then, the sinew coils also enhance strength and durability as they enhance and reinforce all the Marine's tendons and ligaments with Durasteel coils. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the Belisarian furnace. This organ triggers in high stress scenarios and pumps out hormones that act as combat stimulants and enhances the Marine's healing factor to an insane degree. It basically gives the Marines a revive on death buff. In addition to these organs, Primaris Marines are genetically more stable, meaning the notoriously unstable gene seeds like Raven Guard and Space Wolves are able to be reliably used. It is also theorized that this would eliminate gene flaws like the Red Thirst, which would be super hella lame, but luckily that wasn't true and Primaris Marines are allowed to be at least a little bit interesting. Anyways, next up, let's talk about their new equipment. I'll likely go more in depth in a future video, but the basics are they got the Mark 10 Tacticus armor and a whole host of improved weapons. The Mark 10 armor combines aspects of various past armor marks and is designed to be a modular system allowing for configurations befitting a number of roles. This allows the same armor to be used by tanky fellas like aggressors or faster and lighter squads like reavers, simply by changing some plates around and adding equipment to the armor. These configurations are most commonly broken down into Gravis, Phobos, and the standard variants. As for Primaris weapons, they're basically just better versions of the old weapons. They also look a whole lot worse in my opinion, so that's something. The Heavy Bolter especially looks boring as hell compared to the Firstborn equivalents, but we won't get into that now. Almost all the Primaris weapons also have this little tactical fidget spinner doodad, which we can only logically infer is a sole mechanism to make the Primaris weapons stronger and better. But finally, let's close this off with my personal thoughts on Primaris. I didn't want to go fully in depth on the Primaris drama as others have covered a ton already, but I might as well share a few thoughts. And, I personally don't like the Primaris, as to me they symbolize a shift in direction for 40k both lore-wise and aesthetically. Lore-wise, they kind of spit in the face of a core theme of the setting, that being stagnation and decline, which I've talked about before, but essentially, I don't like things like constant Primarchs returning and literally objectively better Space Marines being made because it betrays a fundamental aspect of the setting to sell new things. It also makes 40k end times kind of an inevitability in my eyes, which is super lame. The TLDR of my thoughts is that I kind of prefer 40k as a setting to tell your own stories through games and homebrews or whatnot, with lore events to create atmosphere and help people play thematic games and imagine cool stories, rather than a grand narrative focused on a few key characters like Gilliman, Call, Abaddon, and a few other Primarchs. Basically, I don't want 40k to become Horus Heresy Part 2. I don't think I fully articulate how I feel in this blurb, so I'll make a comment with further context so this video isn't like an hour long. But perhaps an even bigger complaint I have with the Primaris is that I fucking hate their aesthetics. Ew, look at these. The Primaris are a hard line where you can see GW shifting their model design philosophy away from the more grungy and pseudo-gothic future look to a more sleek and tactical generic sci-fi look. And the worst thing is that this permeated to almost all factions. Don't get me wrong, they still make cool models from time to time. I think the new Space Wolves are pretty peak, but in general, having all the Marines with the same exact armor, replacing iconic features of Firstborn, and making the armor modular makes the Marines feel like personality-less stormtroopers or something. Like, just look at this picture. It's subtle, but each and every Marine has little differences that really sell the fact that they're veterans of an endless war with armor made over millennia from remnants of a bygone era. Granted, the first Primaris are newbies and wouldn't have such variation, but they're so damn samey. Even the Tactical Squad model kit has cool, subtle variation between Marines with the exact same armor mark, and I feel that goes a long way. Luckily, it seems GW is backtracking a little bit. Again, the Space Wolves and Black Templar look really cool and unique, but I just don't think we'll ever fully go back to the old aesthetic and feel. Which, if you like the new aesthetic, that's great. I'm not saying you're a fake fan because you like a certain look that I don't, but for me, I do think it kind of betrays a core aspect of what 40k used to be known for. And also, it's just like an objectively shitty move to introduce a new line that is canonically better in every single possible way just to sell new models. Like, let's not lie to ourselves, even if you love Primaris, this was the intention from the start. Like, Space Marine models should be taller than a damn guardsman, but they didn't have to write in lore that these models are new Space Marines who are better in literally every single way possible, and that even your stupid old Marines want to become the new Primaris Space Marines. But yeah, if you want more of my thoughts, I might also make a comment for this, or you can watch this old video where I kind of get the gist of what I feel out, but I don't think I really articulated it as effectively as I hoped since I was still pretty new to video making at the time. But anyways, that's the lore of the Primaris Marines. I'm personally not the biggest fan, but I can see why people like them. Also, how the hell are they gonna replace one of the most iconic helmets in fictions with this shit? I still can't get over that. I know it's a Mark IV and that's cool, blah blah blah. But oh my gosh, these look cool like here and there, but the Mark VII is just so damn iconic. Hi friends, today we're talking about the bestest, most epicest, most coolest guys ever, the Space Marines. And even better, we're talking about the bestest, most epicest, most coolest Space Marines around, the Ultramarines. Now I say that as a joke, but I actually really do like the Ultramarines, and I think they're honestly a bit overhated. Oh, Crackduck likes the Ultramarines. He's so basic. Boo. Yeah, obviously. I like Cadians, what'd you expect? But Roman-themed Space Marines who have the capacity to critically think, that's a cool chapter. And a lot like the Cadians, I feel like the Ultramarines are actually really cool, but they get clowned on since they're the poster boys and, well, let's be honest, they're better at their job than everyone else. But enough of that preamble. Let's get into the lore of the 13th Legion, the Scions of Guilliman, the Ultramarines. But also, before we get into that, let's run through some of the tired old jokes and never mention them again in this video. Ha, Ultramarines, more like ultra boring. These guys are like Smurfs because they're blue. Ha, astute observation. Your chapter symbol is a toilet seat, perhaps in reference to how you get shit on so much. Ha. Need more lieutenants, the range is looking barren, and of course, Robo Gorilla Man, Robot Girly Man, Robert Guile from Street Fighter Man, Robooty Gok Man, and Ruby Gilman, Teenage Kraken. Now that that's out of the way, let's properly get into the Ultramarines. The Ultramarines are the 13th Legion of the first founding and were known as the Warborn before meeting their Ultra Dad Guilliman. This is because they're made up of people of the warring factions of the Caucasus Waste on Earth. Wait, Warborn, Wastelands, and Blue. It kind of reminds me of a certain state whose motto is Battleborn, most known for its wasteland city, and has a suspiciously blue flag. Holy shit, they're Nevada Marines! Upon reuniting with Guilliman, the Warborn became the Ultramarines and were relocated to Macragge. Guilliman highly respects his sons and taught his legion to treat him like a commander and role model rather than a divine king. As such, Guilliman is open to talking to his sons, discussing strategies, and Guilliman has even been, and I quote, known to make the occasional jest. Because, you know, Guilliman's sometimes a bit of a silly man. But silly man aside, during the Great Crusade, Guilliman and his Ultramarines were literally one of the best legions, if not the best legion. They were only second to Horus's Luna Wolves in terms of worlds conquered. However, where I'd argue that the Ultramarines might edge out the Luna Wolves is how they left the world. Although they conquered less worlds, Guilliman would make sure to establish an efficient government, proper defenses, and he would leave advisors to help the new Imperial worlds. This meant that the worlds he conquered were most likely going to stay conquered, and they would be primed to defend themselves even without the Marine legions. At their peak, the Ultramarines were the largest legion, having about 250,000 Marines. They had so many Marines, in fact, that Guilliman had to establish a chapter system as companies were becoming too small organization-wise. These chapters are, of course, the progenitor of the modern-day chapters of 40k. And once Horus went all traitor and stuff, the Ultramarines were a force to be reckoned with. Being such a large legion known for their tactical prowess made them a pressing threat to the traitor legions. Furthermore, it was actually an Ultramarine Sergeant, Aenid Thiel, who first theorized and developed strategies to effectively combat Space Marines. And for this, he was initially reprimanded and punished for even considering killing his brothers, and his helmet was painted red as a mark of shame, since being a redhead is the worst punishment imaginable. However, the tactics he theorized on proved invaluable when half the legions went traitor and almost no one knew how to properly fight Space Marines. After the devastating Battle of Kolth, Thiel was honored and the red helmet of shame became a marker of the sergeant rank. So then, after almost 30,000 years, redheads were finally accepted by society. Which is a bit long if you ask me, but, you know, the world of 40k was created by a British company after all. But after a bit of banter and scrapping, towards the end of the heresy, Guilliman established Imperium Secundus in Macragge after assuming the Emperor was dead and that the Imperium was lost. But then he learned it was not all lost, and he rushed to Holy Terra, wrecking chaos ass along the way. Unfortunately, the Ultramarines were not able to return in time due to warp nonsense. However, the Ultramarines were still a crucial part of the Siege of Terra as they forced Horus to rush his siege plan since he feared getting hit from behind from his big blue brother. After the siege, the Ultramarines were the strongest Loyalist legion since most of the other ones took much heavier losses in the war. Therefore, they led the Loyalist forces in the Great Scouring, where they hunted down the traitors and rebuilt the Imperium. In this time, Guilliman was appointed as the Lord Commander of the Imperium, and he reorganized Imperial leadership. Along with all this, Guilliman created the Codex Astartes as a guide for Space Marine tactics and organization, and of course, to sell to people every few years. Part of this was breaking the legions into smaller chapters so that no one Marine force would be strong enough to threaten the Imperium. Unfortunately, this change caused some issues with his brothers, but they eventually complied since they feared another conflict so soon after the heresy. However, Guilliman's rule went on a 10,000-year-long hiatus when he was nearly killed by Demon Fulgrim on Thalassarea and put into stasis. But this video isn't about Guilliman, he'll get his own eventually, so back to his Ultra Sons. Even without their Primarch, the Ultramarines were a very powerful and prolific chapter, participating in many major box set conflicts, including various Tyrannic Wars and the Assault on Black Reach. They also fought in the War of the Beast, the Damocles Crusade, the Iron Cage, and the Fall Acadia. Then, after their Ultra Daddy's return, the Ultramarines were key combatants in the Indomitus Crusade and Plague Wars. Outside of their battles, the Ultramarines are notable for having a very stable gene seed. And even better, although the gene seed is very stable, it still allows a diverse range of personalities and aptitudes for the Marines given the gene seed. This made them the perfect jack-of-all-trades Space Marines as they're highly adaptable and covered nearly every base. But it also meant that they're inherently more moderate than other chapters, and they couldn't really specialize as well as something like the Space Wolves with their melee and feral aggression, or something like the Raven Guard in their stealth. But that's okay, because they're the Ultramarines, baby! They specialize in being the best! Another benefit of the stable gene seed is that it didn't decay much, even over 10,000 years, so the Ultramarines have a ton of successors, especially since they started out with the most successors in the Heresy. Moreover, the Ultramarines usually keep closer contact with the successors than most other founding chapters do, many of their successors sending representatives to meet with the Lord of Macragge in order to discuss war plans across the galaxy. As for gene seed flaws, the Ultramarines have a terrible one. Their gene seed is said to make them slightly more aggressive than usual and have a quote-unquote tendency towards cohesion and adaptation of hierarchy. Oh no, my soldiers of war are aggressive and they like to work cohesively. Oh, what am I ever gonna do? Why couldn't I have what Russ is having? Ah! Now, this gene flaw is kind of a cop out, but it can manifest in some weaknesses, even if more minor than other chapters. For example, Ultramarines may struggle to work independently, unless you're a video game character, and the adaptation of hierarchy thing to me seems to be tied to their culture in which they constantly strive to rise up in ranks, potentially undermining their own leaders. So basically, they have the weaknesses of Anakin Skywalker, being too ambitious and good at everything, but unable to gain the rank of Master. Plus, they both like blue. But the Ultramarines' real flaw is their strict adherence to the Codex Astartes and their existing tactics, making them quite predictable. This flaw being especially prominent in 40k as, during the Heresy, the Ultramarines were somewhat predictable, but they're also notably adaptive and able to rapidly change their strategies to counter their foes. They even adopted some strategies of particularly competent enemies. However, in the current setting, many Ultramarines view Guilliman's Codex as a holy doctrine and try not to stray too far from its teachings. This can lead to many issues as the Codex was inherently created as a guideline, not a strict law. No matter how comprehensive and tactically adept Guilliman was, he knew he could never cover every single battlefield scenario, and the Codex reflects that. Like, our codexes are outdated in like a week or so you could just imagine how much of an issue it would be over 10,000 years, especially with the emergence of new threats like Tau and Tyranids. Also, following the Codex Astartes to a T can lead you to becoming one of the most hated, if not the most hated characters in the setting. But despite their adherence to their tried and true strategies, they're still highly adaptable and capable of learning from their failures and readjusting to the enemy, even in the modern setting. Think of it like the guy who does the same exact chest opener every single game, but he's able to adapt from there and he almost always comes out on top in the end game. Yeah, sure, they're predictable at first, and this can lead to an early advantage for the enemies, but over the long run, the Ultramarines are able to learn from their foes and come out on top. This makes them nearly unstoppable in long, drawn out wars. During the Heresy, Emo Chad Korax even said that Gilliman's armies were far too adaptable to be able to defeat in war. Another strength the Ultramarines have is from their culture. A super cool thing that the Ultramarines do in battle is considering the practicals and the theoreticals of whatever situation they face. They consider the practical outcomes of whatever theoretical decision they may make near instantaneously and instinctually. This helps them be very tactically flexible. So, the Ultramarines have a reliable backbone to their tactics, but are also able to rapidly adapt to the unpredictable nature of war on the fly. Or, in nerd-ass Dawn of War terms, they have solid, tried-and-true macros and very flexible and adaptable micros, making them truly one of the greatest chapters. Or, at least that's what Gilliman intended for. This kind of approach to battle was somewhat lost over the years as the Codex became more and more sacred. However, with Gilliman's return, he has been reintroducing this approach to his sons, and the Codex is once again being treated more like a guideline, so suck on an egg, Lame Andros! Other than that, the Ultramarines also have a really cool, loose, ancient Roman theme. Their gladiuses, helmet plumes, names, and tactical efficiency all add to the theming. Along with warfare, when most people think of ancient Rome, they think of politics, and of course, the Ultramarines have that by the ultra sackful. Also, much like how TikTok tells me every man thinks of ancient Rome at least once a day, GW also thinks about Ultramarines at least once a day. And finally, another thing I find super cool about the Ultramarines, since I'm a lame-o loser who likes nice characters, is that the Ultramarines are one of the nicer chapters to regular humans. Similar to the Salamanders, Ultramarines find human life sacred and important to protect. While not as doggedly protective over the common folk as the Salamanders, Ultramarines still value ordinary people and will work with them to establish functional Imperial worlds. They also really hate corruption. They try to stamp it out on the all too common corrupt, bureaucratic Imperial worlds. And this is most apparent when Gilliman woke up and probably almost had an ultra heart attack that would send him right back into stasis upon seeing the state of the modern Imperium. But yeah, the Ultramarines are really cool. Sure, they're canonically a bit elitist, and yeah, they're a bit bland at times, and of course, there's the Matt Ward stuff. But at the end of the day, the Ultramarines have a lot going for them. The Roman flavoring is super cool, they have some kick ass bespoke models. Robude Gilliman is one of the most interesting characters in the modern setting, and they always win, of course, and what can I say? I like winners. Plus, in a practical sense, the Ultramarines are probably the most useful chapter there is. And before you ultra kill me for ultra glazing, hear me out. Having an army that can adapt to nearly any situation when you have a galaxy spanning empire with like a million different things that want to kill you is just as, if not more valuable than having ultra specialized chapters. The Ultramarines are truly ultra cool. So, I hope you enjoyed this ultra episode, and if you're an ultra hater of the Ultramarines, well, you probably only watched the first few seconds and left a fuck Ultramarines comment and then left. But if you're a true hater and stayed, I hope this showed you some cooler part of the Ultramarines. And if not, I hope it was a good hate fodder for you. Otherwise, let me know what you think of the Ultramarines in the comments below. Are they overhated, not hated enough, too boring to be hated? Whatever it is, let me know what you think. My god, how can you not look at this and think this is some of the coolest shit ever? And this, the blue and the white, they look so nice. And look at this, all the ultramarine colorways look ultra nice. Hi friends, today we're talking about everyone's favorite stinky doo-doo heads, the Death Guard. And I feel like the Death Guard is like everyone's favorite Chaos Legion now. Is it because of their lore, their sick as hell models, or is it just that they're relatable to the average 40k fan? Just kidding, of course. Except for that one guy we all know who definitely needs a shower. But whatever it is, let's find out today. The Death Guard were the 14th Legion and were originally known as the Dusk Raiders. The original Marines of the 14th were made from warlike clans of Albia and were feared in the early Unification Wars for their namesake tactic of launching huge raids at dusk. Wait, raids at dusk? But anyways, these Dusk Raiders were experts in attrition warfare and defense, heavily utilizing heavy infantry, infantry that was presumably even heavier than the walking tanks that Space Marines already are, but, you know. And this emphasis on resilience and heavy infantry would coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, align exactly with their gene father Mortarian's fighting preferences. Which, speaking of, while his sons were dusk raiding and such, Mortarion landed on a poopy shit planet with a poopy shit atmosphere. Baby Mortarion landed on the death world of Barbarous. Barbarous was a horrible mountainous world with a blanket of thick, toxic fog that was deadly to all life on the planet except for the Xeno, but also maybe not Xeno, necromancer overlords that subjugated the people of Barbarous and conducted evil-ass experiments and such. So, the people of Barbarous toiled away in the valleys beneath the fog and were constantly raided and abducted by the overlords. The young Primarch had landed in the middle of a live battle, and his cries were noticed by the greatest warlord on Barbarous, and also, I'm not sure if you know, but babies are usually pathetic little weaklings, so the fact that this little tiny baby guy was able to breathe, let alone cry in the toxic fog, demonstrated great strength and potential, so the warlord adopted the Primarch and named him Mortarion, Child of Death. And so the warlord Nasser took the bear Mortarion out of the toxic air into his lair, and in his evil-ass billionaire mansion on the hill, he taught Mortarion to emulate his flair for battle. All the while, Mortarion was unaware of the toils of humanity in the valleys over there. Listening to that, wow, that was obnoxious. Let's never rhyme again. But anyways, long story short, Mortarion was trained by his father to fight in his armies against the other warlords, and then one day Mortarion decided that his dad asshole and he hates.
Listen, Dad, I'm a smart fella, and you're a fart smeller, so I'm out of here.
So he went to the valley to check out the little guys, and he realized that the losers that the overlords had subjugated were actually humans, just like him. And realizing his life was a lie, Mortarion said, "It's over, lords!" and swore vengeance on the overlords. And first, since he was a ugly hillbilly, Mortarion had to win the trust of the people. So he helped the village and built friendships, just like Animal Crossing. He also became besties with a young lad called Callous Typhon, who will certainly never do Morty any harm ever. Anyways though, after earning the trust of the people, Mortarion trained them to defend themselves and eventually go on the offense and hunt down the overlords. Mortarion was the first human to ever kill an overlord, and he wouldn't stop at one. And eventually, after many years and hundreds of battles, Morty and his elite unit called the Death Guard, wait, is that a 40k reference? Hunted down all but one overlord, Morty's father Nasser. And as Morty made preparations for the final confrontation, some mysterious and hot stranger made acquaintance with the village elders, and it really pissed off Morty that he was getting glory cucked, so he confronted the man. The stranger challenged Mortarion to single-handedly slay the warlord, or swear fealty to the stranger. And thus, Mortarion was put in between a stud and a smelly place. He was not yet ready to kill the warlord, but if he didn't go now, the stranger would likely steal his glory and win the admiration of Barbarous, overshadowing all the work that Mortarion had done over the years. So, one way or another, Mortarion would have to face his father. And so, Mortarion began his ascent to the peak, and near the top his armor had corroded, his respirator shot, and he fell gasping for air right before his adopted father. Nasser went to slay his wayward son, but the stranger emerged and easily one-shot the overlord, saving Mortarion but also damning him to lifelong bitter assholeness. When recovered, Mortarion kept his promise and swore allegiance to the stranger. In that moment, the stranger revealed himself to be the Emperor of mankind and Mortarion's true father. He reunited Mort with his legion and had him fight for the Imperium. And although Mortarion pledged loyalty to the Emperor, much like an immortal grapefruit, he would be forever bitter and resent the Emperor for stealing his kill and trivializing his accomplishments on Barbarous, along with being a humongo tyrant just like his old father. Which, honestly, kind of fair. Imagine you want to be like the high school football captain or something. You're not only extremely talented, but you also spend a ton of time working hard to get better and win the admiration of your teammates, and right before you get the position, some long, tan, and handsome Superman comes to your school, accomplishes your goal in like 7 seconds with literally no issues at all, steals your thunder, kicks your ribs, steals your girlfriend, poisons your water supply, and is also your dad. Yeah, I think I'd be a little bit angry too, actually. But anyways, Mortarion told his sons that they were his unbroken blades and his death guard, in honor of his warriors on Barbarous. And Bestie Typhon was also made a Marine and eventually first captain of the Death Guard. Reunited, Mortarion taught his boyos his way of warfare, further training their resilience and survival skills. He would also build a resistance to poisons and venoms, Dread Pirate style, in his marines, and one tradition was him sharing a drink with favored marines. This was both an honor and a test, as the drink wasn't your normal appy juice. It was a strange brew of the worst poisons and yuckies from Barbarous, and would push the marines' transhuman immune system to the max, sometimes even knocking out or outright killing the Marines. But those who downed it were greatly praised and became honored of the chapter. Furthermore, Mortarion preferred utilizing vast infantry units of heavily armored elites over vehicles, which, say Morty, same. He did this because he didn't want them to rely on vehicles in order for them to be more independent and adept in any war zone. As such, he equipped his Death Guard with the very best gear. This meant that the Death Guard were adept in fighting in nearly any conditions and were designed to be especially adaptable. Notably, rather than having specialized assault, tactical, and devastator squads, Mortarion taught his sons to be proficient with all weapons, allowing any Marine to forego their bolters in favor of other weapons if the situation called for it. All these came together to make the Death Guard the toughest legion and the favored pick for hazardous environment operations and close quarters combat. And during the Great Crusade, they would continue to be a relentless and formidable legion, enduring the harshest battles and emerging even stronger than ever. Also notably, Mortarion was shunned by basically all the Primarchs, both because he was a bitter asshole to most of them and was also a smelly weirdo. However, he did find friendship with fellow weirdo Conrad Kurz, and he became pals with Horus. Because of course, everyone loves Horus, except for Corax. Also, notably, Mortarion absolutely hated Psychers, both because of the overlords of Barbarous being Psychers, and because of the atrocities he witnessed other Psychers inflicting on his legion and others. Plus, I don't think it's really stated officially, but I'm sure he further hates Psychers since powerful Psychers can pretty easily bypass even the heaviest physical armors and toughness. But anyways, eventually a little something called the Horus Heresy would happen, and Mortarion was actually quite hard to sway to Horus's side despite his strong relationship with the War Master. But Horus somehow gaslit Mortarion into believing that the Emperor was somehow more of a dirty Psyker than the literal gods of the warp. You know, the source of all Psyker energies. Jokes aside though, Mortarion was actually convinced that the Emperor was not only a mega psyker, but also a mega tyrant like Nasser was. Plus, Mortarion still hated psykers, even aligned with Chaos, and refused any Chaos gifts. That was of course until he met up with his favorite son and known swell guy Typhon en route to Terra. For context, earlier in the Great Crusade, Typhon set on his own little crusade, which Mortarion found a bit suspicious, but allowed as he was Morty's bestest pal. And now, Mortarion called for him to reunite with the Legion so that they could fight at full strength. Upon meeting Typhon, he convinced Mortarion to ride to Terra with him on his cool little spaceship, the Terminus Est, instead of Mortarion's usual. And on board, Typhon accused the navigators of being double agents and had them all executed, promising that he could take their place in guiding the ship to Terra. But before that, Typhon allowed the Terminus S to drift unprotected through the warp, and its passengers were soon inflicted with a super mega disease since they put their ship in warp holes and had no protection. The Death Guard were inflicted with the Destroyer Hive, which mutated the host, and this part is really freaking gross, so hold on to your butts. But the hive caused warp flies to lay eggs in the victims' orifices, bloat them up with the yuckies, and then burst with the birth of even more flies. In addition, they mutate horrific growths and their organs constantly burst and mend. All the while, the host is unable to die, doomed to endless torture as the Destroyer Hive cycle endlessly perpetuates. And with that yucky note, Typhon's treachery was revealed. Turns out when he was solo crusading, he discovered Chaos and he actually quite liked it. Which, also, if I'm not mistaken, I think he actually pledged to Chaos even before Horus, which is kind of crazy. But anyways, he set a trap for his father and Legion, and it really bugged Mortarion, so the Primarch tried killing him for his betrayal. Typhon used his secret Psyker powers to put up a bit of a fight, but was inevitably outmatched by the Primarch. However, Typhon was also the host of the Destroyer Hive, and he quickly came back to life. Then, Mortarion unleashed his demon champion, Grulgor. Grulgor had pledged to Mortarion that he would kill Typhon, and he did it! Yippee! But again, Typhon obviously regenerated, and with the pledge fulfilled, the demon merged with Typhon, transforming him into the Herald of Nurgle, Typhus, Lord of Flies. Wait, that can't be right, that's a book. I meant host of the Destroyer Hive. And with Typhus more powerful than ever with the blessings of Nurgle, and Mortarion severely weakened by the Destroyer Hive, Morty got some PTSD flashbacks to Barbarous, suffering before his adoptive father, as well as flashbacks to the shame he felt before the Emperor. And along with the PTSD, he also got a nice side of Nurgle taunting him, saying that without his blessings, Mortarion and his sons would be forever doomed to the torture of the Destroyer Hive. So, faced with the option of flies in his ass forever or literally anything else, Mortarion willingly pledged himself to Nurgle. Yeah, Nurgle totally only takes in those willing to take his blessings, and he totally loves his followers. Oh, what a nice guy. Oh, thanks, buddy, old pal. I'm sure happy that you could help me with the urethra flies that you put there. Oh, I sure know when I'm loved. Thank you, Papa Nurgle. And the fat fuck didn't even have the decency to remove the flies. He just gaslit the Death Guard into being okay with it. Hey Nurgle, I have a present for you. It's the Cool Guy of the Year award. Shove it up your fat ass! But on a less insane note, there are some interesting parallels with this deal and the Emperor's deal on Barbarous. Both were essentially fake choices where poor old Morty was put in an impossible spot and eventually signed himself up to be the pawn of a tyrant that he despised. It's honestly pretty tragic since all the little guy ever wanted to be was a hero to himself, but he's constantly manipulated by forces greater than himself. But anyways, after being forced to accept Nurgle's blessings, Mortarion ascended to demonhood, and his Death Guard were turned into Plague Marines. Although ridden with never-ending grotesque diseases, the Plague Marines were more resilient than ever as the Destroyer Hive and Nurgle's powers gave them unparalleled toughness, regenerative abilities, and attrition. The Death Guard were now truly death incarnate and were an unstoppable force whose mere presence brought death and miasma. The Plague Marines are some of the most, if not the most terrifying foes to face as they horribly mutate and torture their enemies just by existing. It's like the ugly barnacle, except instead of everyone just dying, they suffer endlessly, die, and then worst of all, they have to work for Nurgle. And as time wore on, after the heresy had ended, the Death Guard had only gotten more and more powerful as their Nurgle blessings became more and more potent. So then, after the heresy and killing some worlds, Mortarion eventually kinda just settled down on his plague plan to study the warp further as he hates his current form and he still hates psychers. And while he spends a lot of time on this planet, he's not completely complacent. His plague world is in a spot where it's easier for him to go to real space to conduct raids, and he's also trying to build up his legion to be absolutely humongously unstoppable. Which, also interestingly, the Death Guard, like the other legions, broke into smaller war bands, in their case called Vectorums, but unlike the others, they're still mostly loyal to either Mortarion or Typhus, meaning that they're one of the most unified Chaos forces and they hardly ever battle their battle brothers, unlike pretty much every other Chaos Legion. And in 40k, they're mostly up to the same stuff as before, being resilient, making new diseases, and being real smelly. Except now they've got some new toys. Most notably, they have Psychers now, baby! Morty be damned! Literally. Oh, well, sorry, Mortarion. But as for current events, Mortarion recently headed the Plague Wars, clashing with Guilliman and technically the Emperor, and Typhus leads a great plague fleet across the galaxy, sowing terror and disease everywhere he goes. Also, interestingly, Typhus is low-key probably more favored than Mortarion by Nurgle, as he fully believes in the Chaos cause and is wholly devoted to Nurgle, unlike his more reluctant father and brothers. And other cultural development for the Death Guard are the Mantles of Corruption, in which a Marine can train in one of 7 specialties that I list here. This is pretty cool since it's counter to their pre-heresy ways of being generalists, as they now have some of the most specialists of all the legions. I also think that this may warrant its own video down the line, but my favorites are the Noxious Blightbringers because they just look totally badass and they ring their cute little bells. But anyways, that's the Death Guard, and they're pretty cool. I see why people like them, but they've never really been my jam. I don't really like their current aesthetic of tentacles and crane bellies either. I don't really get the tentacles and belly mouth thing. Is it really as simple as them having belly mounts because, oh, they're fat guys or what? It just doesn't feel consistent with their whole thing of blight, rot, and entropy. They aren't fat because they like to eat Big Macs. They're bloated because their mutated flesh is literally bursting from their armor. I mean, above all else, though, I suppose it does look cool, so that's good enough of an explanation, but I don't know. I certainly prefer the bloated flesh, corroded armor, and oozing viscera. It fits their whole army of the undead and death theme. That being said, though, on a positive note, Mortarian's death look is really super cool, and the flies and bells are actually really cool thematic details. I also like that of all the legions, they're probably the least willing to join Chaos and mostly got forced into it by that asshole Typhus. But overall, I don't know. They're not my absolute least favorite legion, and Mortarion isn't my least favorite Primarch, but they're kind of near the bottom. Perhaps it's just my hatred for Nurgle leaking over, or maybe it's because I literally just think they're gross, which is obviously their whole thing, but if I'm spending tens of hours painting a mini, I'd definitely rather look at something prettier. As for Mortarion, I actually really like his story and tragedy, but I don't really like him as a character. His main character trait of being a bitter jerk just isn't really compelling to me, even if it does make sense and is a sympathetic motivation. He's still leagues better than Angron, though, and honestly more tragic in my opinion. Feel free to yell at me in the comments, I guess. Oh, and did I mention, I really hate Nurgle, and you know what? I wish Gilliman would have just canonically killed him, just fucking killed him, full stop. I think that would have been really funny.